Dr. Robert Califf knows healthcare as a cardiologist, as a leading clinical trialist, as former commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, and now as Alphabet's head of medical strategy and policy. Dr. Califf, as you might be able to tell from his background, is a Blue Devil through and through. A South Carolina native, Dr. Califf attended college and medical school at Duke and completed a cardiology fellowship there before joining as a faculty member. He was the founding member of the Duke Clinical Research Institute, the largest academic clinical research organization in the world, and which has conducted hundreds of clinical trials and research studies in cardiology and other fields. While at Duke, he also created the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, a public-private partnership between the FDA and Duke. As an academic, he has published over 1,200 papers. Gets me exhausted just thinking about that, and is one of the country's most cited researchers. In 2015, he was appointed Deputy Commissioner of the FDA before becoming the FDA's 22nd Commissioner in 2016. When he's not advancing technology for healthcare or stamping out heart disease, he can be found on the basketball court or at Chick-fil-A. We're working on the latter. Rob, welcome to Chet Talks.
Hey, thanks. Good to be here with you. There's nothing wrong with a good diet lemonade from Chick-fil-A for someone that grew up in the South.
We're going to work on that. There are a lot of secondary consequences to all that chicken slaughtering going on in China. The most pressing issue confronting society today is a pandemic. The FDA plays a huge role in addressing that pandemic through its review of new treatments, vaccines, and diagnostic tests. This past Sunday, the FDA gave emergency approval for the expanded use of antibodies to treat COVID-19 infections. These antibodies are derived from the blood of patients who have recovered from the infections. Can you first tell us what your thoughts are on this treatment as a whole?
Well, you're talking about convalescent plasma, which should be differentiated from therapeutic antibodies that are manufactured using recombinant technology that, I sort of had the fun of being in the front wave of in the 1980s with one of the first monoclonal antibodies called ReoPro in cardiology. So convalescent plasma, I think, as people know, is basically people have got infected. You can harvest their plasma after they've had an immune response. And the theory is you give that plasma back to people who are newly infected and it helps them combat the viral disease. So there's a good rationale for it. The problem is we don't really know if it's effective at this point, and we really need to find out.
So this treatment's been used to treat infections in the past. It was used to treat polio before a vaccine was developed. I think it's also used to treat Ebola virus. What promise do you think it has for COVID-19?
Well, I'm optimistic that I think there's a lot of promise. It may be a significant tool in the tool chest. But this actually goes back to the pandemic of 1918. So it's been around as a treatment for a long time. But important to note that in some specific cases, the trials have been negative. So we just don't really know if it is effective. And of course, if you expend a lot of resources on a treatment which has no efficacy, and the toxicity is not huge. A lot of plasma infusions are given for a variety of circumstances. So it's not like a brand new drug where you're worried about the toxicity profile. But, one of the keys, as you all know, Ray, about interventional pharmacology is that all drugs have side effects. And if there's no efficacy by definition, it's not safe. So declaring it safe is also really sort of not quite the right word to use until you've established some degree of offsetting efficacy.
On Monday, you were cited in the New York Times as being critical for how the FDA framed the results of the observational study conducted at the Mayo Clinic that was instrumental, evidently, in the emergency approval. Can you discuss your concerns?
Sure. I mean, first of all, it's important to say, as we've already discussed, that the therapy is promising, and it's amazing the work that's been done to create this enormous registry of people being treated. Because if you think about the logistics here, somebody who's been infected has to be willing to donate. It has to be stored and shipped to the right place, and then given to a person that needs it. And, I think we're over 70,000, maybe even 90,000 Americans treated in this registry, which is being run by Mayo Clinic with help from the FDA. So I don't want to take away from that tremendous effort and the promise that's there. I also, it's clear that EUA, the emergency authorization, is fully within the purview of the FDA without proof of efficacy. There are laws and rules in the federal government that say when you have an emergency situation like a pandemic, the FDA has authority to use its judgment to make a decision, even when the evidence is not in yet. And if we think about this, it's very similar to what you're experiencing in rare diseases that have no treatment. There's consensus in the American people. There are always exceptions in a country as big as ours, but there's a consensus that if there's a lethal disease with no treatment, people are willing to take more risks before all the evidence is in. And then you generate the evidence in the post-market phase. And that puts a lot of power and pressure on the FDA to use judgment instead of just definitive clinical trials. So I'm not objecting to the EUA. I think that's within the authority of the FDA to do. But the presentation and the interpretation of the results given to the public left a lot to be desired. And for some reason, it got into the political framework and was presented as a major achievement of the administration, which is very unusual for the FDA. But very importantly, it was presented as if out of every 100 people with illness due to COVID-19, 35 would have their lives saved, and that was just an error. I don't think there was any malintent, but a 35% relative reduction in risk, as you well know, the number of lives saved is totally dependent on the underlying mortality rate. So what was actually within the study was something like 11% down to 8%. But so it's more like 3 out of 100 saved, which would still be great. But that number is derived from a registry with no control group. So we don't really, it's not the kind of evidence you would normally use. So again, I'm not objecting to the FDA using its best judgment. It's really just when we present these kind of data, we ought to be a little bit more conservative about what we say.
In response to your comments and those of others, the current FDA commissioner, Dr. Stephen Hahn, later tweeted, quote, "I have been criticized for remarks I made about the benefits of convalescent plasma. The criticism is entirely justified. What I should have said better is that the data show a relative risk reduction, not an absolute risk reduction."
Yeah, and it's hard to be critical of a sitting FDA commissioner because I know what it's like. I mean, at least when I was there was a group of people that stayed up all night, worked at night, I guess, and put together a briefing for the executives in the government. And, and there was one for the FDA. And so every morning I get up at 5:30 and read about all the people who were taking shots at me. And some of them were very vicious. And it's just, so you don't want to contribute to that. This is, my comments were more intended to help Steve come back and just straighten out the record. And again, FDA has authority to do this. It's not overstepping the boundaries, but we have to be careful about how we say things. And we also shouldn't confuse political achievements with scientific achievements.
In addition to new treatments for the disease, numerous companies are developing vaccines for COVID-19. Which vaccines or approaches have you most excited?
I think, Ray, I'm a scorekeeper by profession. As a kid, I used to keep the statistics in baseball, Little League Baseball. I also played the game. So I like to play the game and do the scorekeeping. But in cardiology, most of my role has been developing systems to evaluate outcomes and quality, including clinical trials, but also registries and natural history studies. And with regard to vaccines, I'm just an empirical guy. Let's do the test. I've been pretty lousy at picking out which treatments are going to work, and that's why we need clinical trials. At the FDA, there's a saying, "In God we trust, all others must bring data." The one thing I will point out that's been, sort of a back worry that all of us have is that most of the vaccines are being developed against the spike protein, and that may not be the most important target. It seems like it should be, but so often we're fooled by biology and how complicated it is. So that's a worry, but I'm pretty optimistic given the results so far.
So you say you like to trust data. So what outcome measures do you think will be required for approval for the vaccine? Will it be production of antibodies, prevention of disease, other measures?
Well, we already know that the vaccines produce, all the ones going forward in the phase 3 trials produce antibodies. So that's not a worry. And one reason to be optimistic is in the animal models, it looks like you do get a preventive type of antibody response. Now, the FDA has already published a criteria. It's publicly known that a 50% treatment effect is needed. But keep in mind, here we're talking about a complex thing. If it ends up like the flu vaccine, it'll prevent some episodes, but it also will reduce severity of disease in others. And so you sort of have to wait and see. It seems unlikely that it'll be totally preventive. That would be fantastic, but I wouldn't expect it. It seems highly likely it will have an ameliorating effect. And then, of course, we'll have to look for toxicities. There's some worry about low levels of antibody or vaccine triggering a hyperimmune response. That's happened with some other vaccines in the SARS class, but you just don't know about that until you treat enough people to see what happens. So, the great thing is these trials are enrolling. We'll know. It's interesting. I just learned today that the Advisory Committee for Vaccines is going to meet on October 22nd of this coming October, which implies they may be expecting to have initial readout by then.
So an FDA Advisory Committee in October 22nd, you mentioned earlier about not wanting to confuse politics with science with the FDA. October 22nd is about 2 weeks before the national elections. Any thoughts?
Just, what can I say? People can put 2 and 2 together, but on the other hand, looking at the trials enrolling, it could well be that we will have a readout. Remember that at least on the efficacy side, if you enroll people in a high transmission area, much like, in cardiovascular trials, we always say it's not the number of patients, it's the number of events. And the same is true here. You just need a certain number of infections in the control group, and then you've got your answer as to whether the vaccine worked by the number of infections in the intervention group. And that could happen very quickly. So, I don't know what spurred that particular date. Politically astute people may have reason to wonder, but what the heck, I don't care what the political reason is. If there's an effective vaccine by October 22nd, we should all have a big celebration.
Outstanding. While we wait for October 22nd and new treatments and vaccines, the most pressing issue appears to be diagnostic testing. One of the keys to understanding the virulence of COVID-19 and to enabling increased social interaction and economic activity is widespread testing for the virus. 8 months into the pandemic, the wealthiest country in the world does not have such testing. Why?
I think comparing the U.S. to most of the rest of the world is always an important thing to do. And I think the answer is the same here as it is for our healthcare outcomes in general. I remember that prior to the pandemic, we were in the midst of 5 out of the last 6 years seeing a reduction in life expectancy, something I never thought I would see. Out of the top 18 high-income countries in the world, we're in last place in life expectancy and losing ground. Or another way of saying it, if you were just looking at this as something to purchase, you'd say American healthcare is approximately twice the cost with the worst outcomes. Who would ever buy that product? It's not a good product. And I think, in my view, the main reason is we're paying for the wrong things in a fragmented system, which is not put together to produce the best health outcomes at a reasonable cost. It's put together to pay piecemeal for things that people value for one reason or another, which we could talk about. And the end result is a system that's not coordinated and is very difficult to achieve a concerted outcome in such a system. It may do spectacularly well for particular people with particular problems that are highly valued. And I think, so then if you look at the testing, I think another really interesting issue that's in play, the system was not only fragmented, but it lacked resilience. That is, in an economy which is built in just-in-time manufacturing and just-in-time delivery in order to maximize short-term profit, you're not prepared if all of a sudden you need to make 5 times as much of whatever it is, and your supply chain is not organized or in any position to be revved up. And so, in my view, those are the main factors. It's a fragmentation of the system and a just-in-time economy. And what we're seeing in terms of our higher mortality, remember, important to separate one thing: higher rates of infection. Overall total mortality in the U.S. is not that much higher than a small body of countries, but it's definitely not exemplary. It's not in the best position. And remember that it's not only the COVID specific deaths, but also we're seeing a rise in deaths from other causes, because the fact that the pandemic is not well controlled means that people are concerned about seeking health care and may not be taking as good a care of themselves as they should. So all those factors play in.
Into that fragmented system, Alphabet, or Verily, is stepping in. It recently announced it's opening its own lab for COVID-19 testing. Can you tell us about it? Is it just for Verily's employees, or does it have bigger aspirations?
Well, what happened with us is that the governor's office in California pretty early on called up and said, is there anything you can do with the help of the testing? Because as you remember, when we started, the manufacturers of tests were sort of going along at their usual pace, and it was going to take a while to get revved up. And so there was also a data problem, because the standard public health system for infections is positive tests get reported to the state authority, and then those test results get passed on to county officials who do the contact tracing. And so it turned out we had a system called Baseline, which we've been working on for years, which is intended to be building a community of people who contribute health data. And we could see right away that using that system to conduct the testing, not to do the laboratory part of the test, but just to organize a system where people could sign up, get a time to get their tests done, get the result in a computer system, and aggregate statistics that would be helpful to the state, that was going to be useful. Well, it was useful, and it ended up, we now have over 300 testing sites and distributed across the U.S., a partnership with Rite Aid and a few other entities. And we're really focused in community-based testing, because if you're a patient, let's say at University of Rochester, and you live nearby, the university system can do its own testing, but you got a lot of people in the U.S. who aren't closely affiliated with a health system, particularly the disenfranchised, the less well-off people that live in rural areas. And so that's where we've been focused with our testing. Well, now here we are months later, we still don't have an adequate capability of doing the tests. In our 300 sites, the test turnaround time was growing. And so we figured at least to help out, since we had a laboratory doing research studies, let's convert that into a CLIA lab and, at least add the share that we can to the testing capability. So that's what we've done. We don't have grand aspirations to become a laboratory testing company for clinical service. We're really just pitching in because, we are a privileged company with a lot of resources compared to the average and a lot of talented people who can pitch in.
We have simple, inexpensive, sensitive urine tests for pregnancy, 98% sensitivity 7 days post-implantation. Why don't we have the same for COVID-19?
Well, I think there are several components of this. I don't know what. Sorry about that. Yeah, sorry. The phone is going to ring because we're back in our home in Durham, and no, I hung up. But no one would. This is a new virus, so it's going to take some time. So pregnancy's been around a little bit longer than this virus, I think, and there's been time to work it out. So that's one factor. Under the best of circumstances, it would take time to get this worked out. But I also think, there were some issues that arose that sort of gummed up the works for a while. And I now think with the RADx program that NIH has, it's like $1 billion going into stimulating faster turnaround, accurate tests. And I think the FDA has now figured out the flexibility needed to make it possible, and has the flexibility, as we've already discussed, through EUAs and diagnostics, to give the green light before all the data are in. But we also learned something from the antibody tests that were promulgated. When the FDA let down the guard too much, a bunch of tests got on the market that were no good. And so this is always a tightrope with the FDA. I always like to say, you're in the right spot when all sides are pissed off. Then you've hit exactly the right spot, because there's just no question in a country this big, that's so entrepreneurial, there will be people who try to take advantage of the rules to make money. There will be vast majority of people who will try to play by the rules and do it right. And you want to do everything you can to stop the people that are cheats and scoundrels, and help and encourage the people that are doing it right. But in the end, just like we talked about convalescent plasma, it's the data that should drive the decisions.
On that data, what do you think of the saliva test available by researchers at Yale? Is that promising? Is that something that could be used in the near term?
I still need to learn a little bit more. I've been able to follow it because there's a group that has a weekly phone call and has talked about it through its development. So I think they deserve a lot of credit for getting a test that may be simpler and easier to use. But at least from what I understand, the scalability is still going to be a bit of a limit. But, we'll overcome those things. I think saliva test, good step forward, not the ultimate answer, but, a big achievement by that group that's been working on it. And we have to say, I'm a basketball fan, so the NBA has done pretty darn well, and this was an NBA sponsored effort, which I think is really interesting.
Now switching from COVID to just clinical trials in general, the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted clinical care and clinical trials for all other therapies. The vast majority of clinical trials for conditions other than COVID-19 have been paused or delayed. In weeks, we saw widespread adoption of telemedicine, up to 100-fold increases for clinical care. Are we going to see similar changes in the way we conduct clinical trials?
Well, we're already seeing them. The so-called COVID flag from the FDA enables any sponsor to say, I'm going to do it differently. And, then the requirement is that you justify it. So when all the dust settles, you can show that you had a good reason. And we're going to learn as we go through this to get the right balance of telemedicine, digital visits. The example I like to give is that if you had an idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis today, the last place on earth you'd like to be is in a clinic near other people who might be infected. And so, that community has worked out some ingenious methods for collecting endpoints without the study team even opening the door to the house. And I really think, that kind of creativity will give us a stronger sense of what works and what doesn't. And, when the pandemic is either gone or under control, I think we'll reset things. We've already learned, for example, we have an addiction program that's based in Dayton, Ohio right now, where it was amazing for me to see how the clinic visits went to, essentially 100% digital very quickly. And there are major advantages to it. Like, someone who's addicted and trying to recover often has trouble, with motivation to, get out of bed and get in the car and go to the clinic. Now you can just call them and you have the visit while they're still lying in bed if you need to get it done. And you can have many short visits very efficiently, as opposed to the waiting time and all the stuff that happens. But you also see that people actually like the human interaction. So a purely digital intervention is not going to cut it. And I think the same is true for clinical trials. It's just a matter of finding the right mix for the particular trial and problem that you're dealing with.
You mentioned idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. The FDA, as I understand it, has accepted moderate to vigorous physical activity as assessed by an accelerometer as a primary outcome measure, an endpoint for trials in idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Do you see the FDA and other regulatory authorities moving towards greater acceptance of these digital endpoints?
Well, for sure, I see them moving towards greater acceptance, but we shouldn't make light of the work that the digital health community and the clinical research community needs to do to actually validate which technologies work under what circumstances. And, I noticed that you're working closely with the DIME Society, and I think the information coming out of that collaboration and CTTI that you mentioned, says, it's okay to say that you should be able to measure these endpoints using sensors and biomarkers, but proving that it actually works is an entirely different story. And I would say, I'm in an area and a company with, I would say the world's best engineers at doing this. But it's actually really hard dealing with missing data and artifact and all the biases that can get in is not simple. And there's a lot of work to do.
We're getting a lot of questions that are starting to come in. Just a reminder, we're going to take questions from all of you in a few minutes. But you mentioned your current work with Alphabet, which is currently acquiring Fitbit. Will digital endpoints be captured on consumer devices like Fitbit?
Well, I can't really talk about Fitbit because that potential acquisition is under adjudication by the regulatory authorities in US and Europe right now. So it may not go through. We'll have to wait and see. But, the Apple Watch is sort of a hybrid really now because of the work that's been done to validate some of their work. And it may well be that consumer devices will be adequate, but that's where a lot of work needs to be done. As I think we've worked on a research watch, which has a lot of sensors built into it, and it's given us a chance looking at the raw data to see how difficult this can actually be to really have it ready for prime time.
Related to the watch and Fitbit, yesterday Fitbit unveiled an ECG-enabled smartwatch and recently reported that they were able to detect half of COVID-19 cases one day before patients reported symptoms. Will wearable sensors identify people with COVID before diagnostic tests?
Well, I think we have to be careful about, this sort of gets back to our first discussion about the FDA. So detecting half of patients, what does that really mean? You're really talking about a probabilistic estimate from a learned model on a population. And when they say detect half of people, you're not talking about a definitive diagnosis the way we think about, let's say, a measure of viral load. You're talking about a probabilistic estimate that exceeds some threshold of likelihood. And so to understand the value of that detection, you really need to see the entire operating characteristics of the algorithm. At different levels of true positivity, you're going to have different levels of false positivity. And back in the old days, one of the things that was fun for me hearing the discussions, back in the good old days, we used to think sensitivity and specificity were fixed attributes of a test or an algorithm. We wrote one of the first papers showing that's not true. Sensitivity and specificity vary as a function of the pretest probability of the population that's being studied. So, will that algorithm be useful in practice? I don't know. Maybe it's also picking up snotty noses and UTIs and all sorts of other things. Now, if you ask me, looking into the future, will we be equipped in a way where a flag goes up and says, Ray may have something wrong, you need to get evaluated? That I'm pretty enthusiastic about. But disease-specific outcomes from a watch other than heart rhythm or blood pressure or gait disturbances that the watch is directly measuring, I am a little bit skeptical in terms of clinical utility.
So you recently took this new role as Alphabet's new head of medical strategy and policy. What has you most excited about your new position at Alphabet?
Yeah, let me just give a little primer on that and a little clarification. So, when I left the FDA after the election, I didn't have a job for the first time in over 40 years. And fortunately, Duke wanted to take me back, but also my old friend Andy Conrad from Verily wanted to offer me a job. So we split jobs. I went back to the university. We started basically a data science institute that's evolved now to an AI institute. I feel very good about that. And I took the job as clinical advisor at Verily, which basically is a job where I sort of hang out and mentor people and get asked to help with various projects. And when I see something that I think needs attention, I focus on it and help get it done. Last September, I walked out the door one day at Duke. If you've been on the Duke campus, there's the administration building for the medical school is, and the health system is in a beautiful Gothic building built in 1928, where when you walk out the front door, you're on the main campus of the university. It's just a beautiful setting. It was a September day, and I was walking across to the hotel across on the other side of campus for a meeting. And lo and behold, it was the first day of classes, and I realized exactly 50 years ago, I had walked on the campus as a freshman at Duke. And that sort of told me maybe a half a century is enough time. So I retired from Duke, and they asked me, David Feinberg from Google Health said, why don't you do for Google Health what you're doing for Verily? Because, we could use some crotchety old people that have seen things that worked and things that didn't. And so that's what I'm doing. And just remember, Alphabet is like an umbrella company. It would be like a health system with many hospitals. And there are multiple companies. Google is one of them. Verily is another. Verily is entirely focused on the regulated biomedical product space. Google Health does a variety of things within the Google part of the company. Just some other parts of the company you may recognize. Calico is a company that's developing drugs for aging. Waymo is the autonomous vehicle company. There are many others that are in the fold. And so my job title is actually clinical strategy and policy, because we have a chief medical officer, Jess Mega, who's fantastic, a Brigham trained cardiologist. And we, on the Verily side and on the Google Health side, we have a chief health officer, Karen DeSalvo, who was undersecretary at Health and Human Services when I was at FDA. And Karen was just president of the General Internal Medicine Society and also highly qualified. So they have line responsibility. I'm more of someone who gives advice and powers through key programs. And the intent was that I would spend a lot of time translating what we're doing in venues like this, but we sort of got disrupted by the pandemic and turned our attention to the pandemic. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So what has you most excited?
Well, let me just say, what has me most excited overall is that we have billions of people who access Google products every day. And on the Google Health side, the buildup of medical expertise under Karen's leadership and David Feinberg, I think is making those products a lot better when you look up information related to your health. Remembering that the biggest determinants of your health are not your doctor until you get really sick. They're what you do every day. So that interaction with search, and I have to say, you know, my generation is not the YouTube generation. I had no idea how many people don't even read anything now. They just look at videos, and YouTube is an enormous source of information related to health. So making that better when you're dealing with billions of people, a small improvement is tremendously important. On the Verily side, it's really, you know, it's mostly US focused right now because we're in bad shape in the US. I mean, Ray, I'll bet that when you were going through medical school, you didn't think that you would be a leader of a country's establishment that has the worst health of any high-income country. The worst health outcomes, the highest mortality rates, the shortest life expectancy, for the most money. And so what has me really excited at Verily is that our mission is to organize information in a way that enables people to have better health at a lower cost. You know about Don Berwick's triple goals of better outcomes, lower costs, better experience. And I am an advocate. It's a little controversial, but I also believe now we need to add the fourth outcome to it, which is better experience for clinicians. You know, I was talking with someone from the UK earlier this morning. And one thing we have in common is we have a lot of clinicians, doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists who are unhappy with their working conditions and feel like they're overwhelmed and not adequately supported. So we want to organize information and make it useful for people so that we can do a better job. I'm very excited about that.
I'm going to turn out some questions from our listeners. Emmanuel Gilberto asks, are you concerned about the pressure that the Trump administration is putting on the FDA for COVID-19 vaccines prior to completion of phase 3 trials?
Well, I mean, first I'd say anyone who believes the FDA is not affected by politics would be extraordinarily naive. The FDA commissioner is a political appointment made by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and it's part of the executive branch of the government that ultimately reports to the president. However, one of the main jobs of the FDA commissioner is to protect the civil servants. There are 17,000 civil servants and 10 to 20 political appointees in the FDA. And Of course, as presidents come and go, political appointees come and go, but the civil servants are there for a career. And by design, they cannot have a financial conflict of interest. So they get paid less than comparable people, but they have a great job of protecting the public health and advancing the science of regulatory affairs. So it'd be naive to think there's not political influence. FDA commissioner's job is to protect the decision making. And also just to, be clear about it, in the history of the FDA, almost never does the commissioner make a decision about an individual medical product. It's done by the civil servants with the top decision-making authority resting with the center director at the FDA. So drugs, biologics, and devices all have different centers, and those leaders are really vested with decision-making. Legally, the commissioner or the secretary of HHS or the president could overrule the center director, but that's almost never happened in the history of the FDA.
Jandrika asks, since as you noticed in the convalescent plasma study, it was an uncontrolled study, there was no control arm. Can we even say that there was a relative risk reduction associated with administration of the plasma?
I think it would be proper to say that any relative risk reduction was presumed. And I mean, the one part of the study that's most enticing, remember they start with a very large number, and then they had a few thousand people that actually had their antibody titers, in whom the donations had the antibody titers measured. And they were measured by, I would say, a less than optimal method, but they were measured. And when they looked at the tertiles, the donations that had the lowest antibody levels had the highest mortality rates. The donations with the highest antibody titers had the lowest mortality rate. So it's equivalent in some sense to a dose response study with a drug, where typically if you say we have a dose response in the direction that we would expect, then that's not unreasonable evidence that there's a therapeutic effect. But there is an argument, which if you go to, there's a biostatistician named Frank Harrell, who does essentially a blog for statisticians. If you go to Frank's website, which is easy to find, you'll see some really interesting arguments that and of course it's entirely possible that the low titer donation group did better did worse because it was actually harmful. As giving plasma with a low titer of therapeutic antibodies may actually do harm, and there could be no effect of the high titer sort of offsetting. And we just won't know until we have a properly done randomized trial.
Where are we regarding the development of therapeutic monoclonal antibodies against COVID-19? They should be more effective than convalescent plasma.
That's a hope, and there's some evidence from the previous SARS virus that that's going to be the case. I mean, the small trials done with the outbreak in Asia in the previous SARS virus situation, the trials look really good. So there's great reason to be optimistic about the therapeutic antibodies. But given the magnitude of the pandemic, just manufacturing, let's say they are highly effective, manufacturing the level of doses that would be needed is just an overwhelming thing to consider. So it's going to take time, and we'll have a distribution problem. But those trials are not going so well because of the logistics. You have to get a test result back in a reasonable period of time so that you're getting the therapeutic antibody when you would expect for there to be an effect. I mean, most people develop an antibody response anyway after some period of time, and giving more antibodies then is probably not going to be helpful. So you got to give it, before the antibody response is up and going. And it's very hard in the US system to find the right people at the right time and get them recruited.
Dr. Adam Dicker from Thomas Jefferson University asks, if you could redo medical school education or graduate medical education, what suggestions would you have?
Holy smokes. I mean, there's another reason I left after 50 years. I think at some point you charge up the hill a certain number of times and you just say, okay, I need to have my effect somewhere else. Because I do think that medical education in particular is very outmoded and needs a major overhaul, but it's going to be very difficult to do it. The Flexner report was a long time ago, and it sort of had this interesting effect of, it was really good at the time it came out because there needed to be a grounding of medicine and biology. But then it got instantiated that biology in some ways was like the only thing that mattered, when we know that's not the case. And it's this interesting thing that happened that I love about the Hopkins School of Public Health, where you end up with these two entities, a great school of medicine, a great school of public health. And the School of Public Health on the wall says, saving lives millions at a time. And on the one case, you have doctors dealing with individual patients, and on the other, you have public health people dealing with sampling of populations and policies to affect outcomes. The great thing about now is everyone has an electronic health record, so we have the whole population available. And I personally believe that medical education should be much more empirically based. That is, doctors should learn that the only way to really know what you're doing is to have the evidence from well-done studies, and then to practice according to that evidence, and then mix that in with all the skills that you need on an interpersonal level. Optimize automation through digital technology. And then the healthcare professionals become people who guide people through their health and illness episodes, applying the best evidence and using their interpersonal skills and using technology to optimize their time, not to eat up their time as currently is happening. But that, if you think about that scenario, if I'm right, you need a very different medical education at the front end.
So quick plug for the University of Rochester. In the 1970s, George Engel wrote a paper in Science on the biopsychosocial model for medicine, clearly identifying that biology is important but insufficient to thinking about the whole person. Rob Wilson from Health Mode asked, you built an AI center at Duke, and Google is obviously an AI powerhouse. What's the lowest hanging fruit to apply AI to improve health?
Well, I think the thing that's furthest advanced is imaging of any kind. Basically, if you have a digitized image, we now know that if you have enough cases with ground truth, the application of an algorithm to that image is going to do as well as a human reader. And in some cases, as you get better and better data, even better than your average reader. Remembering that whether it's a radiologist looking at a radiologic study, or a cardiologist looking at an angiogram, or a dermatologist looking at a skin lesion, you're distracted by things. You may have had a bad day in the office. You may be sleepy because you're up writing a paper, whatever. The computer doesn't have those problems. And so I think those things are well underway, and they will become, I believe, part of the background noise, not to replace the clinical input, but as I said before, to serve up information in a way that the clinical person can spend time doing what clinicians should do, which is integrating the information in a human way with the other person on the other side of the equation. But if you ask me what I'm most excited about, it's actually the application of algorithms to outpatient data. Most of the health gains that we can get would come from preempting demise in chronic diseases and managing those diseases better by better information, rather than waiting for someone to show up in the clinic every 6 weeks or 3 months. I mean, Ray, you've preached this too. There's no reason why we shouldn't have people following. I'm sorry. Oh, I see what this is. Um, I got too much going on today, but there's no reason why you shouldn't live in a somewhat digitized environment where people are interacting all the time with better information and being monitored if they have a chronic disease, so that they don't have to go to the clinic except for the things where you really need a human interaction to get it done. Even then, a lot of that, as we've learned, can be done through telehealth. So um, if you just think about using algorithms to intercept deterioration or risk in outpatients, that's where we can make the big difference. You know, an example, I was supposed to talk to the Society of Cardiac Anesthesiologists. There's a group I love because I used to deal with them all the time when I ran the cardiac intensive care unit for many years. And also I have a daughter who had congenital heart surgery and has done wonderfully well. So I really appreciate the profession. But, if you think about the problem of aortic stenosis and TAVR, we probably have thousands of people who can't walk across the room or are short of breath, who may be in extended care facilities, whatever. Because this is the US, they've all had echoes. But whether someone gets referred for a TAVR now just depends on whether a clinician happens to put it together and realizes that you can actually have a procedure done percutaneously that may not, cause a 20-year increase in life expectancy, but may allow a grandparent to spend time with their grandkids. A fairly simple thing. So there's no reason why every health system shouldn't run an algorithm on its echoes every day and say, this person looks like they may be a candidate for a TAVR. Let's find out. The other one that really gets me because of what happened at the FDA, where the president's Committee on Science and Technology concluded that the FDA was responsible for the lack of hearing aids in the US. And loss of hearing is now the fourth leading cause of disability in the world and a very big predictor of increased mortality, because when people can't hear, a lot of bad things happen to them. You can test hearing now with a cell phone. And, why don't we run an algorithm on everybody and figure out who needs hearing aids? Now, the hard part is, as I learned as I responded at the FDA and we changed some of the regulations, it's not like reading glasses where you just get a hearing aid and put it in. There's a huge cognitive adaptation. There are a lot of social factors. So we need clinicians involved, but we're just letting people sit out there and no one's asking or thinking about, can they actually hear? It's just, why don't we use the technology effectively would be the question.
For more on hearing, our previous chat talk was with Dr. Charlotte Yeh, Chief Medical Officer of ARP and a very passionate person on hearing. A brief plug for our next chat talk, which is Tuesday, September 1st at 12 noon. We'll be speaking with Dr. Trent Haywood, who is the former Chief Medical Officer of the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association and the Deputy Chief Medical Officer for CMS. He now advises healthcare startups. So if you want to know if insurers and Medicare are ready to embrace digital health, you'll join us next time, September 1st. So we got an election coming up very soon. You previously served in public service for a Democratic administration. Do you have any thoughts about going back to public service? And if you did, what would you want to do?
Well, I feel like I'll always be in public service in terms of working to support the civil servants who inhabit HHS and try to do their best. I will say the FDA commissioner was the best job I ever had. I loved every minute of it, even though I was under attack like you should be. But you feel like you're really doing something that matters and trying to use the very best of your judgment. And I say that never having had a job that I didn't love. I mean, running a coronary care unit is amazing. Running a research institute, working at a tech company, they're great jobs, but FDA commissioner was the best. And, if asked, I'd think about it, but I'm about to turn 69. I know the current presidential candidates are even older than that, but I'll support it in any way I can. But let me just add, Ray, I think it's very important that we change the payment system in the US so that people are accountable for populations of other people in a way that improves their health outcomes at a lower cost. I think if we do that, you'll see the ingenuity of American healthcare just flower in a whole different way. Like if the payment system was that way, we'd do a lot of telehealth, not crying about the reimbursement, but by saying, hey, you know, we're going to do a better job if we're in contact with people in a way that's convenient for them. And ultimately that will lead to fewer strokes and heart attacks and disability inducing events for people. And then the second thing is we need to revamp the federal computing system at HHS. Anyone trying to decipher the data coming out about COVID hopefully will agree with that. It's a major job that really needs to be done.
Well, we could go on all day, but you have a lot of phone calls. You're a busy person. I want to first thank you very much for joining us on Chet Talks, and more broadly, thank you very much for all of your service to improve the country's health, both as an academic, as a public servant, and now in the technology world.
You bet, Ray. Have a good day, and thanks for all that you're doing. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Until our next discussion, the Center for Health and Technology at the University of Rochester, thanks you for joining us. Thanks again, Rob.